people ask me where I am from, I will say Olathe, because that's where I went to high school, lived after college, all of that. But when people ask where I grew up, I would say Wichita. I lived there until the summer after 8th grade. And I'll never forget that summer. That was the last year of middle school in Wichita for me. And middle school is hard. As I watch my son about to enter 8th grade, which is crazy, and my middle daughter about to finish elementary school, I can't help but think of myself at that age. Middle school started off pretty rough for me. I had a hard time in 6th grade with a bully and just being awkward, And in 7th grade, I started to make more friends, and I found that I really liked choir. 8th grade, though, was like when I really hit my stride, right? I made really good friends. I wrote for the newspaper. I had my first boyfriend. I hung out with large groups on the weekends, got invited to slumber parties, and felt like I was part of something. So I'll never forget the last day of 8th grade, Mom. When her and my dad sat me and my sister down and said, we're moving. The last day of 8th grade, my friend Lindsay and I had planned this big party at her house. And so everybody was coming, right? So when I got home and my parents told us that, I then had to go to the party and tell all my friends that I was moving. And that was just a big bummer. In the summer, I remember that summer went really well, except for when my boyfriend broke up with me on email. And then, how rude, right? And then, we had my 14th birthday party a little early, and the cops were called because we TP'd someone's house. But beyond those two things, it was a really, really great, last summer in Wichita. But one of the hardest things to leave was our church. Our whole family cried on that last Sunday. My parents had been going there since they were first married. All of us had been baptized there, and my sister and I were really involved, so it was hard to go. But I'll never forget pulling up to our new house on Hunter Drive in Olathe, and my parents said, look, that's the Methodist church that's being built right behind our house. Grace United Methodist Church in Olathe was building a new site, and it was literally in our backyard. And this was not an unfamiliar church. For years, the church West Heights United Methodist in Wichita had been bringing the youth group to Kansas City to go to Worlds of Fun, and we would stay at Grace United Methodist. So I knew this place. It was a sign from God. Keep moving forward. You're all going to be okay. Even when life feels uncertain, I am with you. When my world felt like it was falling apart, God was showing me to just keep having faith, and that God would provide what I needed in order to thrive. And I did. 9th grade was great. I found 2 of my lifelong friends, Lindsay at church and Lacey in theater. I became involved with choir and the youth group and felt belonging, and it all worked out. The unknown, the uncertainty of how it would all turn out will always be foundational to me. It's a time in my life I will always be thankful for, because it taught me resilience and courage to keep moving forward, and that God shows up in ordinary things, like a church being built in your backyard. We meet a 14-year-old-ish Daniel today, and 3 of his friends. These are young Israelite boys who have been brought to the king's court to assimilate into their culture and way of being. Judah had fallen to Babylon, and King Nebuchadnezzar not only took possessions out of the temple, but he also took Judah's future, the young men that would have been leaders, and he attempts to turn them against their people and their God. Daniel and these boys were given different names and given the high honor of being able to eat the same food as the royal court. These boys were being used as a tool to show the other Judeans not to revolt against Babylonian rule. And Daniel, a faithful Jewish boy, made a request. He said he could not eat that food because it would go against his religious beliefs, and he did not want to defile himself. It was a spiritual request he was making. And the king's food was defiled for 3 reasons. It was likely not kosher, it was likely sacrificed to idol gods, and eating the king's food implied fellowship with the Babylonian culture system. He asked to be given water and vegetables, ordinary, simple food, and essentially told, you better think about that. The king will see this as a rejection of him, and kings in those days were known for cruel and severe punishments. If you paid attention to the reading, he said he was worried about his head. So Daniel says, okay, how about this? You give the 4 of us only vegetables and water for 10 days, and we will prove that we will grow strong and be of use to the king. So it's agreed upon, and 10 days later, they're found to be healthier and more nourished than any of the others who ate the king's food. Daniel and these 3 would go on to be favored by the king, and that will serve them well as their story unfolds. Simple vegetables and water were a symbol for them of their faith. They were living in a time of uncertainty, and the only thing they were sure of was their faith. They had every reason to be mad at God. Their whole world had been turned upside down. God, who had made the covenant with Abraham and the Israelites in the wilderness, they could have said, God allowed this to happen, but they don't, because their faith is stronger than that. They knew that God had delivered their people from Egypt, had walked with them through the wilderness, and covenanted to never leave them. So they don't bow down to the powers that be. They ask for the vegetables and water to prove that their God, the God of Abraham, would sustain them and bring them through. We all live with uncertainty in our lives. We don't know what will happen each day we wake up. And when we hold on to our faith, we also know that nothing can separate us from the love of God, and that in the end, God will always win. What strikes me most about this story isn't the vegetables. They're simply a metaphor for what Daniel was holding on to. It's that Daniel decided before the pressure ever came who he belonged to. Everything else had already been taken from him. His home was gone, his family was gone, his language was being changed, his education was being changed, even his name had been changed. The Babylonians had renamed him Belteshazzar because they wanted him to forget who he was. Because that's what empire does. It doesn't just conquer land, it tries to conquer identity. It says, become more like us, compromise just a little, no one will notice, it's easier this way. Assimilate and integrate, and you will belong. And Daniel quietly says, no. And he doesn't say this with violence or arrogance, just faithful obedience. Sometimes resilient faith doesn't look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like asking for vegetables and quietly choosing integrity when no one else notices. In our lives, it can be refusing to laugh at a joke everyone else laughs at because you know it degrades and diminishes another person. It can look like speaking up for someone that everyone else ignores, the lost and forgotten, the ones pushed to the margins. It's showing up to church on Sunday mornings when other people are choosing something else. It's forgiving someone for their actions against you or someone else when revenge is so much sweeter. The world tells us that power changes the world. Daniel reminds us that faithfulness changes people. And when we hold on to our faith, the uncertainty, the unknown, the standing up to those in power isn't scary. It's necessary, and that's what changes the world. Daniel makes his choice before he knows how the rest of his story is going to unfold. He has no idea what's going to happen when he does this. And he chooses God first. He has no idea that one day he's going to go on to interpret dreams and visions. He has no idea that he will become one of the most trusted advisors in the king's court. He also has no idea that his friends will face a fiery furnace, or that he himself will spend one night in a den of hungry lions. He doesn't know any of that. All he knows is this moment. Recently, I have been thinking about, I've been reading the book, Reading the Truth, which was written in memory of Rachel Held Evans, who was a theologian and writer. She passed away in 2019. And after she died, her husband and her friend Sarah Bessie put together a collection of her essays and then kind of responded to them. Rachel had been raised evangelical, but over time she began asking questions and wrestling with doubts about things she had been taught by church leaders. So for years, she wrote about those questions and experiences on her blog. sharing what it looked like to move forward with a faith that was honest, searching, and still deeply rooted in Jesus. Rachel had a lot of feelings that she wrote about in 2016 about the election that was taking place. And in one of her essays, she writes about how Christians can respond when the world feels like it's falling apart. She talks about how our calling is not to surrender to fear, but to practice ordinary acts of faithfulness. She writes, plant gardens, make art, raise babies, read books, bake bread, tell the truth, build bridges, practice kindness, embody mercy, work for justice. And that's exactly what Daniel is doing. Daniel did not overthrow an empire. He did not lead a rebellion against Babylon. He simply asked for vegetables and water. And through that ordinary act of faithfulness, Daniel showed that his God was still present, that his God still showed up. And the powers of the world tried to take away his identity, his people, and his faith. Daniel chose faithfulness. He remembered who he was, and even more importantly, he remembered whose he was. God's. That's faith. That is resilient faith in the face of uncertainty. We do not know how our stories will unfold. We may not know what tomorrow brings. We may not know how the conflicts of the world will be resolved. But we do know this. Our story begins and ends with God. Resilient faith in the face of power is choosing God, even if it feels costly. It's choosing ordinary responses to the things that seek to divide us and harm us. Resilient faith is saying, I will not allow the powers of the world to defile or define me. Resilient faith is saying, I will not let political ads, social media, or the loudest voices convince me that any human is anything less than holy. Resilient faith is saying, I will not accept language that treats immigrants as disposable instead of beloved children of God. It is saying, I will not be silent when people of color are killed unjustly or when systems of power escape accountability. It's saying, I will not support violence that continues to take the lives of innocent people no matter where they live. I will not dismiss the truth or ignore the care of God's creation because it's politically convenient. I will not allow fear to shape my heart more than faith. Resilient faith is faithfulness. And I know that sometimes faithfulness looks far less dramatic than we imagine. Sometimes it looks like vegetables and water. It looks like standing in the gaps when no one else will, and trusting that God's plan, God's love, will win in the end. When I look back at that time I was talking about in the beginning, I can see that God had already gone ahead of me. When I thought my life was ending because we were moving, God already had lifelong friends waiting for me. When I wondered if I would ever belong again, God had already placed a church in my backyard. And that church would mold me and help me grow in my understanding of faith. A faith that sustains me even in uncertainty. And I wonder how many of us are standing in that place today. That uncertainty of what's next. Maybe you've received a diagnosis you weren't expecting. Maybe you're grieving someone you love. Maybe you're worried about your job or your marriage feels uncertain. Maybe your child is making choices that keep you up at night. Or you're about to begin a new school year, a new job, or a new chapter. You don't know what tomorrow holds or what is going to happen in our world, and neither did Daniel. And neither did 14-year-old me. But both discovered the same truth. God was already there. The God who walked with Daniel into Babylon had already gone ahead of him, and that same God has already gone ahead of you, because God is faithful enough. This story isn't about vegetables and water. It's about strength and the hope that Daniel received when he put his strength in God. His hope in the God who had been faithful to Abraham, the God who parted the Red Sea, the God who had walked with Israel through the wilderness, and the God who keeps covenant generation after generation. And we know that same God through Jesus Christ. The one who stepped into our uncertainty, the one who entered exile with us, the one who defeated sin, death, and the grave, and the one who promises, I am always with you. This promise means we don't have to know the future. We simply have to know who walks with us into it. As we begin this journey through Daniel over the next few weeks, I want you to ask yourself one question. What is the vegetables and water in your life? What is the simple act of faithfulness that reminds you and tells the world that your identity belongs to God? Because resilient faith isn't built in the lion's den. It begins long before that. It begins with the small, ordinary choices that declare day after day, I belong to God. And when we live that way, we discover what Daniel discovered all those years ago, that kingdoms of this world will rise and fall. Circumstances will change, people will disappoint us, the future will remain uncertain, but the God who walks beside us never changes. So whatever uncertainty you walked in carrying today, keep moving forward, keep trusting, keep choosing faithfulness. Maybe so. Amen. Amen. At this time, I invite the offering. The offering is a time for us to give back to God in response to the living Word of God. And I invite you to see where God is calling you to give today.